Making artist book is especially rewarding because as the author, you have a great amount of creative agency. It's like facing a blank canvas. You write and you paint. I find it very fulfilling. For instance, here I include some design references during the process of my visual research. Michael Mason is the designer of the book, and we both looked at numerous objects from the Oriental Silk shop, taking inspirations from certain graphic elements and the general style that would communicate the emotional value of the shop without being too direct or literal. For instance, we were fascinated by the handwritten tags, ornamental labels. Some are extremely beautiful and elaborate. Some are more delicate and ritual, both serving utilitarian purposes. We also studied dye lines from the pattern books. So they're used to make clothes, like DIY clothes, those pattern books. They look akin to maps that indicate movement and orientation. So that are also some of the key topics of Oriental Silk. Many of these elements are extracted and transformed into visual languages of the book. I think if you hold the book in your hand, the tactility of different textures and the consideration of multiple colors and details will be evident. In terms of the content, I was very interested in investigating how one story could be told in multiple ways through various media and translations. This perplexing approach is also reflected in the book's organization. For example, I separate sections of prose narrative with series of images printed on colored paper. The margins of the white pages that make up the book's narrative are shorter than the colored pages, on which readers encounter most of the images. I consider this design a book inside a book because I love the idea to have readers discover the story of Oriental Silk through searching and finding, just like my own encounter with Mr. Wang and the shop's rich history. However, Oriental Silk is not only a document of interpersonal relationships. It also raises political, economic, and philosophical questions. Kenneth Wang's accounts of family history often repeat the harshest examples of Asian American migration trajectories. His great-grandfather was one of the many Chinese laborers who risked life building the Transcontinental Railroad and was immediately erased from that history. His father purchased another immigrant's paperwork in order to make it to the US in 1941, and subsequently was drafted to the American Army to fight in Europe during World War II, another quite unknown history. I also concern myself with more subtle, complicated examples of Orientalism with references to Anime Wang, who actually gave the idea to Ken's parents to open the Oriental Silk importing company. Anime Wang was the first Chinese-American star who was constantly dismissed of the best roles in American cinema due to her race and humble background. Her story in the book serves as a parallel for the similar complexity of my understanding of Kenneth Wang's romanticized view of Chinese culture, which is influenced by Orientalist American notions, but also a deeply personal reverence for his family and their legacy. The Chinese title of the project, Xiangchou, literally translates as silks from tongue, but has the same pronunciation as the word for nostalgia, 乡愁 in Mandarin. In writing the book, I allowed myself to be more personal, letting the reader into my connection with the Oriental Silk world. If in the film I was stepping back to disappear and document behind the camera, in the book I stepped forward. The reader I had in mind for the book was someone who had an understanding of both Western and Chinese cultures, or who wanted to gain a wider perspective on them. Moreover, maybe someone who's deeply concerned with the nature of art and craft. There are numerous layers, such as diasporic identity, the relationship between history and the individual, the meaning of craftsmanship, the cultural value of silk production that I had been processing since the beginning of the project, that were already in the film, but not necessarily apparent to every audience. So I tried to incorporate this more concretely in the book. The book was also informed by the exchanges I had with the public after showing the film in different places. I would get all sorts of questions. Some people wanted to know more about the film's protagonist, Mr. Wang, while others were interested in understanding how to connect his personal story to historical narratives. Here's a quote from my book. I feel films are more fluid, but the written word is more profound. Using different media to convey the same story enables me to come at it from different angles and to keep finding new aspects of the story that move me.
Can we get into silk, please?
So yeah, finally, so those are some of the threads of thoughts that led to the making of this bilingual book. And finally, here's some information about where to get the book. So thanks to Vivian, it's available at Guanghua as well in London's Chinatown. I used to live in London also for 3 years. So for me, it's a very nice connection to know that my book is also in London's Chinatown. So yeah, and thank you very much. Now I will play a film trailer of Oriental Silk. It's 2 minutes. Then we can discuss more.
It's our pleasure to talk the book, Xiaowen.
Thank you, Vivian. So I will show the video on my screen, but I will also send a link to the chat. So in case if for some people's internet, it doesn't play very well, feel free to open the link. I think I need to stop sharing my screen first. Not sure, or maybe. I'm trying to find where I can send the chat. Here we go. So I'm gonna paste the link here, then I'll share my screen again.
People used to come here in the 70s and 80s, Red Buttons' wife used to be a regular customer. One time he came with his wife. He didn't want to wait his turn. He said to my dad, do you know who I am? He said, I'm Red Buttons. And my dad said, well, glad to meet you. I'm Mr. Wong.
Oh, is that beautiful? This is really, really incredible.
Yeah, now all you find is machine embroidery.
And just mass produced.
Yeah. I had a customer. She bought the 100 children and made pajamas for Lourdes, for Madonna's daughter. I was told that they were Lourdes' favorite pajamas. This business is very people-oriented, and so that's very rewarding. You can't find these anymore. Nobody makes these. And you look at the detail. This is all hand-painted. The workmanship is just so fine. I don't think people understand. People need to know where they came from. I watched them start this business from nothing. I never understood my mom's feelings for my father until after he passed. So it's hard to let go.
Thank you so much, Xiaowen, for the introduction and the beautiful movie trailer. I watched your film a few times, and every time it has been very, very touching for me. And you mentioned that how the narration through the film and through the books are very different. And so now that we watched a little bit of a film, I think it would be a good idea that we can have a little bit of book reading to see how that this story is told differently. Xiaowen, would you like to choose a paragraph and start in Chinese first?
Yeah, so Nicky and I, what we're going to try to do is that we picked like 2 pages from the book, and I'm going to read the Chinese paragraph first, and then Nicky will read the correspondent English paragraph. Then we'll do it alternately. Nicky, are you ready? I think Nicky is you're muted.
Okay.
But yeah. Oh, I think Nicky is muted.
Hi, I'm here.
Okay, then I will start.
Yeah.
说起来，父亲并不是我们家族第一个远渡重洋的。我曾祖父年轻的时候是村里第一批去美国打工的，那时也不叫打工，其实是做苦力，在广东叫做卖猪仔，要签卖身契，很多都是被拐骗去的，遭到各种非人待遇，大多猪仔都有去无回。我曾祖父和其他大批猪仔一起，像货物一样被运到美国旧金山，先在旧金山参与建铁路，后来又去挖金矿。中国苦力工作的路段都是最艰险的，当时的安全条件极差，每修1公里就要死好多人。不过祖父福大命大，做了几年苦力之后，不仅四肢健全，还攒了一点小钱，就以此为本，一路赌钱赌到了墨西哥。曾祖父在华工中是赌博高手，眼见几个赌技不如他的同乡都去墨西哥赌钱翻了本，当然不免眼红心热。也不知他在墨西哥待了多久，终于有一天，曾祖父居然找不到开门营业的赌场了，因为当地所有赌场只要远远地看到曾祖父的身影走近，就立即紧锁大门，无论他怎么敲门也不开，生怕又被赌神清场。于是曾祖父称了称已经装满2只木柜的金子，决定衣锦还乡了。
And the English. Actually, my father was not the first in the family to go overseas. When my great-grandfather was young, he'd been in the first group of villagers to go and get jobs in America. Da gong, we call it now, get a job. But back then it was called coolie labor. and the locals called it selling the piglet. A lot of villagers were fooled by labor contractors and sold themselves almost as slaves. They found the conditions extremely harsh, and many never made it back home. My great-grandfather and the other village piglets were loaded on board like cattle and shipped off to California. He worked on the Transcontinental Railroad and then in the California gold mines. The sections of road and track that the Chinese coolies were given were always the most difficult. The work was appallingly dangerous too, and for every kilometer built, there were many deaths. But my great-grandfather had luck on his side, and he not only survived a few years of this unscathed, he accumulated some savings too. With this as his capital, he took to gambling and ended up in Mexico. He was really good at it, the best amongst his fellow laborers. And when he saw gamblers who were no better than he was going there and doubling their money, he couldn't resist going too. I don't know how long he spent in Mexico, but finally one day he couldn't find a single cantina open for business. They'd seen him coming and shut up shop. In fact, they were so afraid of being cleaned out that they refused to open up to this gambling demon, no matter how hard he banged on the door. So my great-grandfather got out his 2 wooden seaman's chests, weighed the gold pieces in them, and decided to quit while he was winning.
实际上，曾祖父是被迫返乡的。当时，他与其他华人一起被墨西哥遣返，因为他们低价出售劳动力，抢了当地人的饭碗。不过，衣锦还乡的曾祖父觉得自己光宗耀祖了，不仅没缺胳膊少腿，居然还带回2柜金子，下半辈子可以高枕无忧了吧？可是再想想，乡下连年灾祸不断。就算自己下半辈子有了保障，也难保儿孙一辈子吃喝不愁。他看着这2柜子黄金，曾经以为重如泰山，其实也不过有钱人1年的零花钱。不行，一定要再接再厉，把2柜子变成4柜子，4柜子变成8柜子。
Mute. There we go. In fact, my great-grandfather was forced to leave. The Chinese were deported from Mexico at the time because they would work for less pay and thus took jobs away from the local Mexicans. But at least he was going home, having done well for himself and brought honor to the family ancestors. He still had all 4 limbs intact, and he'd arrived back home with his 2 chests of gold. So at first, he felt he could take it easy for the rest of his life. But then he had second thoughts. Life at home was a succession of disasters. And even if he could live on his winnings, it wouldn't keep his children and his children's children going for long. He looked at his chests full of gold pieces, and even though they were as heavy as Mount Tai, as the saying goes, they were no more than a year's pocket money for a wealthy man. It was no good. He'd have to go on earning, turning 2 chests of gold into 4 and 4 into 8.
主意既定，曾祖父不着急置办房产地产，而是把所有黄金全数投入赌场。墨西哥赌神，我的曾祖父就这样在短短几个月内，把2柜子黄金，他生平拥有过的最大财富，迅速败光了。这也是父亲读到小学6年级后不能继续学业的原因。
Okay. Right. No sooner said than done. My great-grandfather didn't bother to buy land or build a house. Mexico's gambling demon simply took his entire fortune and gambled with it. And he gambled away every last cent of his hard-earned money. 2 whole chests of gold within the space of just a few months. That was the reason why my father had to drop out of school after 6th grade.
那再说说令尊是如何去的美国呢？我听得津津有味，也不觉站得吃力。请黄先生继续往下说。我父亲不想走曾祖父的老路，去美国当苦力，九死一生。就算赚了钱，最终还是要回到家乡继续当农民。父亲想在美国定居。当时的中国农村生存条件太差，他不愿意自己的孩子再过那样的生活。想归想，但一个中国农民怎么能去美国赚钱养家呢？当时有个机会，由于1906年旧金山的一场大火，移民局的档案馆给烧毁了，很多已经拿到美国身份的华工资料失去了存档。聪明的华人就在福建、广东等地兜售这些华工的移民证件，买家便可冒充证件上的人，在坐船抵达旧金山的时候，告诉移民局官员，自己的资料在大火中遗失了。只要通过了移民局的盘问，就可以直接登岸，过起美国华人的生活。父亲的同乡也在兜售华工的证件。父亲左思右想，与其在家坐吃等死，不如倾其所有，去美国搏上一搏。母亲与父亲自婚后就一直同心，她愿意带着女儿在家乡等父亲。就这样，父亲变卖了所有能变卖的家产，购得移民证件，就此踏上了他的美国梦征途。
I'd been standing for a long time at this point, but I was scarcely aware of that because I was so intrigued by his story. I asked him to continue. Please tell me how your father got to America. My father didn't want to follow in my great-grandfather's footsteps and come as coolie labor, dicing with death. Earning money, yes, but ending up back home working the land again. My father wanted to come in the US live in the US permanently. After all, life for a Chinese farmer was backbreakingly hard. He didn't want that for his children. He racked his brains. How was a Chinese farmer to settle in America and make enough money to support his family? Actually, there was a way. The great earthquake and fire of San Francisco in 1906 had destroyed all the migrant workers' documentation, including the files on many Chinese workers who had obtained papers. As a result, some enterprising Chinese Americans were taking bundles of immigration papers to Fujian and Guangdong provinces and selling them to the locals, who would then set sail for San Francisco. On arrival, they could pass themselves off as the original holder of the papers and tell the immigration officer that their files had been burned in the Great Fire. Provided that they could get through the officer's interrogation, they would be able to land and begin life as Chinese Americans themselves. Some of the men in my father's village were selling papers, and my father, having thought hard about it, decided that rather than grow old and die there, he would rather put everything he had into going to America. My mother and my father always agreed about everything, and she said she would wait for him at home with their daughter. So my father sold all their possessions, bought his papers, and set out to fulfill his American dream. That's it.
That's the end of it. Thank you so much for your reading. This is a very beautiful reading, but very sad story. I go to a lot of Chinese people's like a Chinatown history museums. I went to the one in San Francisco, I went to the one in New York, and I read all about the coolies and the fire at the immigration office, etc. But it's never the same. When I read Xiaowen's book, she really brought that things on the paper to life, to reality. And it's so wonderful. It happened as she walked into the shop and started to talk to the shop owner and allow the conversation to evolve, and she just digs in so much and explored such a wonderful story that spans generations. Wonderful, but also a very sad story. So when I know that a lot of your work concerns migration, and you yourself travels a lot as an artist as well. Why did you choose that focus, or why does this aspect interest you the most?
I think, speaking of personal experience, when I grew up in China, I think Vivian and I were probably like same generation. When I grew up in China, traveling, especially traveling abroad, was always considered a luxury. Or especially traveling abroad, I think for the first decade of my life, it was something I would only dream of. I think because of that craving, and because also what my parents' generation experienced during the Cultural Revolution, they were both sent off to faraway rural area, not by choice. And then in return, what they wanted for me was always this freedom of choice and freedom of movement. So I think, then when I was a teenager, then I started forming this idea that in the future I would like to study abroad and also live abroad. Then naturally, alongside my personal experience, I just encounter many interesting people and subjects, and you realize, even like a small shop like Oriental Silk that doesn't look very prominent at first glance, but if you are curious and you show your genuine interest, everyone has a story. And everyone has a history and legacy, and everyone also has their own way of telling it. So that's what really fascinates me.
And do you feel like you, as someone who's a migrant, who's migrating all the time as well, do you feel like you would be telling the story of other migrants from a different perspective? Would that affect the way how you tell their stories?
Yes, so first off, I definitely resonate a lot with what Kenneth Wang told me, in like interviewing him and also filming him, and then our ongoing conversation throughout the past 5-6 years, even after the film was complete, even now after the book is complete, we still have quite regular email exchange with each other. Because for me personally, like, I don't have generational migration experience, but Ken's family has. So I feel like in a way it helps me to process what migration movement mobility means to me as an individual, but also to my community. And I feel like making art enables me to kind of jump in between different communities. Doesn't really matter if I was in America or UK or now in Germany. I think people working in the arts or in the literary world, we use so much of our imagination, and we're very curious people. We always want to understand. We're not satisfied with what we're told. We want to ask questions. So I think in a way, the territory for me is not necessarily national borders, but it's much more communicated through different channels of people's stories, histories, and ideas.
Do you feel like we just had 2 years of a pandemic and a lot of countries are in lockdown? It greatly restricted people's movement, and we felt it was not the same anymore. Do you feel like at this time, publishing this book, Oriental Silk, would bring new light to this kind of a dramatic situation here?
Yeah, I was very happy because I decided to publish the book in 2019. Then 2020, the pandemic, the outbreak began. So it was actually kind of like a good time for making publishing projects. I also know many wonderful books have been published, you know, in the past couple of years. And a lot of bookshops, especially here in Germany, you know, just the ones I know, they're doing exceptionally well. Because even during the lockdown, bookshops were considered essential shops, so they never had to close. They always remained their opening hours. So yeah, so I was fortunate that I had this book project during the pandemic, and as all of you probably know, you know, the editorial process, it requires a lot of patience and just going over and over again. Sometimes I even felt like as if I was embroidering, you know, because just really lots of details and the nuances, and you can sometimes you almost feel like you can't get out of it again because you're just in that word completely. But then because of that, it distracts you from the problems and the very immediate difficulties you experience in your everyday life. So for instance, if you'd struggle to go grocery shopping and find out all the things you had on your shopping list, everything was sold out, right? But then you come back to the book, then you can calm down again because in the book you have everything you need. You can even create more things.
Yes, that's lovely. Yeah, I think I do also think the lockdown time is a wonderful time for reading more books and discovering more inside, the inside of you. Nicky, you're the person who bridges two cultures. You translate loads of works. Do you have experience with people in migration?
Yes and no. I suppose you could call it vicarious experience. I'm pretty much home-based in the UK, but I live most of the time in London. My children's father is from Latin America, so the Latin American community of migrants to London during the 80s, 90s, 2000s, right up until now. These migrant communities were part of our lives, and my children grew up bilingual.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a lot of Chinese friends as well. I can't say I'm very involved in the the community of Chinese migrants in London, although I know some. But yes, I'm very aware. I think Zhu Xiaowen put it beautifully. Everybody has a story, and it's so important that these stories shouldn't be forgotten. And so that's why it was such a pleasure to translate this book, and really very moving, because this was one guy's story, but it went much deeper than that. It went right back to the roots of his family and world events as they affected his family. And it became very personal. So I love that aspect of this book.
Is there a part that touched you the most, Nicky, in this book? Which parts did you enjoy translating the most?
Well, two bits, right? I mean, I was very keen that the terminology for the silk should be absolutely accurate, and I love silk, and I loved looking at the pictures, and I loved working out the words, but it wasn't really, I mean, what I think struck me most emotionally was the backstory. The story of Ken's father and mother, like the mother with her daughter was in China during the war, and the terrible privations that they suffered. I mean, I've read books about it and I've translated books about it, but reading about how she survived, there was one extraordinary detail that she used to sell salt, and her only way of getting the salt from the area from which it came to where she could sell it was by soaking her jacket in salt water, so that she was walking in a freezing cold, salt-laden padded jacket, and then get to the other end. She could get the salt out and sell it. I mean, extraordinarily brave. And I'm sure if you looked at this lady when she was still alive in America, you could not have imagined that she'd been through things like that. So yeah, I love the backstory.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, at Chinatown, because our bookshop is in Chinatown, we have lots of customers sometimes coming in, and all they do is to buy 1 pound of newspaper. But when you actually start talking to them, they've been through to wars, like in Hong Kong. They've had a really hard story immigrating to the UK. But if you don't talk to them, you'll never know that they have such an extraordinary story in their memory. Xiaowen, I was actually, before you had a presentation, I was very curious that why you decided to make the book on top of the film. But you explained it so well. I wonder, like, could you explain it a little bit more to us, like how you managed to put in more layers of context and content into this book? Because that part of that you explained, it was very interesting.
Yeah, so in a way, all those different layers and elements, they were always there, like in my mind. In some cases, in the back of my mind, I was kind of also digging them out, because I think for me it was important that the book was not only about the story, but about the environment, how the story lived and came to life and got presented. Because I was very aware the whole time of the fact that I met Ken in LA. He didn't speak Mandarin, so we spoke in English, and he was native, Californian, born and raised. So Nicky always mentioned to me, Ken has this Californian accent, even though when I told him Ken, he said, I don't know what a Californian accent is. But so I gathered all the material, all the stories in Ken's voice, in English.
Yeah.
And then I wrote the story in Chinese. So I was already translating it from Ken's voice to my voice. But while writing it, I tried to keep it as authentic as possible, just the way how I memorized him as a character. And then Nicky translated my story from Chinese to English. And of course, Nicky is British. So she was also crossing references, between British English and American English. And I had an American editor. And then we also showed the story we showed the translation to Ken also multiple times. Overall, he was very happy about it. He didn't give much, critical feedback, but he was rather amused because there were a few phrases he was unfamiliar with, and he said it must be British English.
Nicky, was that your biggest challenge? You're trying to pretend that what was the decision? How was the decision made there? Would you rather translate the original American voice, or would you prefer to use British English?
No, I would love to have given him back his original American voice, but one of the main challenges with all translation is to give your characters a voice. It doesn't matter whether it's fiction or non-fiction, memoirs or interviews or what. Your characters in translation have to have a convincing voice. But unfortunately, I don't speak American. So I was very aware that I couldn't make him sound too British. But I'm really glad actually, shows the importance of the role of the editor and of the original interviewee, that he could look at it. And I'm very tickled that he found my Britishisms and put into his mouth. I'd love to know which particular ones they were. But yeah, it's that's why you need editors. I can't write American English. I can only write British English. So I just do my best to avoid the most obvious Britishisms if my character is either actually American or is going to be read by American readers, in which case the American publishers will certainly have a view on it.
Sure. I think it's partly also the beauty of writing and communicating, then translating, because you're constantly, like Xiaowen said, creating a different layer on top of each, on top of the other, and actually bring back a different product, which is a very interesting experience. Nicky, we did lots of events together. But I think in my memory, this is the first time that we're talking about a nonfiction book that you translated. How is the difference? How is the experience different from translating a fiction book?
I don't think there is much difference, really. I mean, the difference is, ultimately, the differences are between written Chinese and written English. The differences are so enormous that, that they far outweigh the differences between translating, if I can describe it, as literary non-fiction and literary fiction. I already mentioned the issue, the challenge of conveying the voice. Well, that obviously is extremely important in fiction. You need to convey the voice of the protagonists in the story. But of course, absolutely the same works for non-fiction. You might think that you would have more technical and specific terminology in non-fiction than in fiction, but that is not true. My experience of translating fiction is that it's just as important to get the words right. And of course, with non-fiction, absolutely, we've got to get the words right. So I think ultimately there's not, the challenges are the same. It's just as difficult.
And it came out beautifully, I have to say. I really enjoyed reading both Xiaowen's writing and Nicky's translation. I remember when Xiaowen was showing the trailer, there is a moment of Mr. Wang showing a 100 children sort of fabric. The silk fabric with 100 children on it. That looks absolutely beautiful. And also after I watched the film, in the film, Mr. Wang repeatedly mentioned that the nowadays the machine-made silk is much more coarse, and the old days craftsmanship is much more delicate. Do you guys have an opinion on that? Like I know Xiaowen may have an experience when she was young going to look at the silk with her mother in Shanghai. And do you feel that this kind of a local crafts appreciation for the local craftsmanship is being lost? And the globalization thing is kind of changing how we appreciate things.
Yeah, I think like one thing about this whole project, about this book, is that there are many layers of information, emotion, and also mediation. So I feel like as the creator, as the author of the book, I'm very aware that whatever Ken tells me, it's through his voice, his understanding, it's through his worldview, right? So of course, on one hand, the mass-produced commodity definitely doesn't have as fine quality as it used to be, like during the state economy, because back then it was not so much about productivity, especially the silk goods Ken's family initially imported in the 1970s, those were produced in China for exporting. So, so inherently, they already had much higher quality, than the domestic goods. But then getting back to your question, so I was actually thinking that in the past decade, there's with the growth of the middle class in China, there's definitely like an increasing demand of high quality craftsmanship, like everyone shops online on Taobao, right? And so like handmade or natural material, craftsmanship, all those are keywords. Whether or not how real those words communicate, but they're like the selling points for a lot of products. And also I think like in a lot of developed regions and cities in China, craftsmanship, they are like maintained quite well. There are different sorts of like institutions and also organizations, and then a lot of highly skilled people, they're rewarded as like intangible, cultural heritage preserve. They have all those kind of honors, and they keep training also young people. But then we also have to be aware of this gap, right, between the middle class, well-to-do, who can afford and who keep pursuing all those high-quality craftsmanship, and then those who can't. So I feel like there's like a whole topic about affordability and accessibility to knowledge, to craftsmanship as like a training, and also to resources. Yeah, so that's one thing. And then the other thing I thought about is how globalization presses this challenge of climate issues. Because before the pandemic, and for us, I think we were very used to travel long distance, take the long distance flight, and also buy things from China. I think like maybe once a while I would order things from China, and then I receive this package, and it was like Christmas. I would just like open everything's like, yes, But nowadays we can't do that due to the pandemic. But then it also kind of makes you rethink about all those convenient things in life, right? And then I thought about the fact that there's something very environmental of old shops, like about old shops like Oriental Silk, because essentially they have a large quantity of inventories. They just sit in their warehouse. Like in the case of Oriental Silk, he has so many inventories, so many silks. They might be old-fashioned or out of fashion, but there must be some creative way to use and regenerate, the value of those silks, because they have been imported. They already traveled through this long journey from China to America. I think it was even by shipping containers, and they already arrived, and they are high quality materials. But maybe just because there's not enough promotion, or maybe silk itself is not very, in trend for like fast fashion, whatever, no one's using them. But then it asks this, at the same time, we can ask the question, what if we just use what we have? They are sitting there in the warehouse, they're not going anywhere, and then if you start asking this question, that expands to all kinds of resources and materials and everything else.
Thank you, Xiaowen. Nikki, do you have a view on it? Do you want to share your thoughts?
Only that I would just love to go to a really nice silk shop. See,
I'm sure you'll do.
And I look forward to my next opportunity to do it. Maybe when I next go to China. It's so fascinating, and it's so tactile. It's so wonderful to feel as well as to look.
Yes, absolutely. I have to mention this book is a very, very beautiful. Like Xiaowen introduced, there's like it's a gray cover, but there inside it's like there are colorful layers of pages, just like how Xiaowen discovered the story, dig the story deeper and deeper. I just thought I have a question in the chat. Someone's asking if the book is in stock. I will just give everyone an update on Monday about the stock of the book. And Guanghua is open these days. We are open every day, and so do feel free to visit us. I just wonder if anyone has a question for Xiaowen and Nikki. If you do, you can unmute yourself and speak up if you want to. As I wait for anyone to type up or think of a question, I would like to ask Xiaowen, are you working on any other project at the moment?
Yeah, so during the lockdown in Berlin, I took a lot of walks and I always took my camera. So as a result, I had like hundreds of photos from my normal camera. So I'm looking at putting together a photo book to reflect this special period of time, because a lot of those photos, they were just taken in my neighborhood, you know, just a couple of blocks down. Sometimes there are also many repetitive motifs because there are just so many buildings, you know, within the distance I would go out to. So yeah, and I'm also working on a short story that's inspired by my recent trip to Greece, because I flew somewhere for the first time after like 1.5 years. Yeah, so that's a story I'm working on now.
Great. And Nicky, yourself?
I've never been busier than during COVID. It seems like everyone wants to send me translation to do. So I'm just finishing another novel by Zhao Pinghua. And
is it Mountain Whispers? Is it Mountain Whispers?
No, that's come out already. This is his most recent novel, which is called Zanzuo, which we're calling working title The Sojourn Tea Shop. But very exciting news is I'm about to start a new novel by with Helen Wong, who is here in the meeting today, and we're translating together Dinner for Six, Liu Renwen, by Lu Min. Yeah, so this is a new project and we'll finish it next spring. And it's very exciting. It will be published by Balestier Press. So that is going to be absolutely and completely different from Zhao Pinghua novels. And I'm really, really looking forward to it, because I think a lot of people who read Chinese think that this, that Lu Min is a wonderful woman writer and really should have been translated. However, now her time is coming, and this novel should hit the bookshop sometime next year.
Yes, looking forward to it. I know the Dinner at Six, Dinner with Six it's already translated, has already been translated to many other languages. So it's great to see it coming out in English finally. I've got some questions, people asking, Nina is asking, is there a shop in London that sells the kind of handmade Chinese silk that Ken Wong stocks in LA? I think it will take another Xiaowen to find one. I mean, I personally have not seen one, but maybe I'm just not observative as Xiaowen is. So I wish there could be one. Wish to try. And the next lesson to I guess. I have a response here from Cicely. She says, thanks for the response. Wish to be transported to Mr. Wang's silk shop. And the next best thing is to hold Mr. Zhu's book in hand, I guess. Thanks for the opportunity to hear the author and the wonderful journey leading to the book. So thank you for the response. Yes, if no one else has a question, I guess our event can just end here. And thank you so much, Xiaowen, for this wonderful book and for your time. And thanks, Nicky, as well. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope you enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, Vivian, for organizing.
I hope to see you all soon at our next event. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Nikki. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.